Jewish story goes back pretty far. The story goes back to, if you remember, the history of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Looking at how these three patriarchs and their relationship with God, Jewish people are able to look back and see that line and say, look at how they had a relationship with God, and look at how we as a people have had a relationship with God, and that wrestling that they've experienced, just like Jacob on that night when he was there, wrestling with the angel, the representative of God, wrestling with God himself. And that wrestling characterizes, for many Jewish people, that their relationship to God, that there is this wrestling that happens in maybe this is something that you experience. You're wrestling with God, understanding who God is, understanding what is my purpose, why are these things happening to me, and that kind of wrestling happens. It happens in every single relationship, whether it be a spouse, or a child, or a parent, or a friend, or a coworker. I mean, every relationship has its wrestlings. The disciples also had their own wrestlings. They got to a point in their relationship with Jesus that there were some moments of tension, and we looked at those over the past number of Sabbaths as we've been looking through the book of Matthew. How the disciples, how Peter specifically approaches Jesus, and Jesus praises him one moment, saying that God revealed to you something, and then the next moment he rebukes Peter and says, get behind me, and even throws his lot in with Satan and saying, this is the work of the devil. And in that wrestling with the disciples, trying to understand, who is this Jesus? Who is he? Is he a prophet? Is he a good teacher? Or is he something more? That process of wrestling, it happens. And then to get to that point, on that crucifixion time when all of their hopes, all of their dreams, all their expectations were shattered, and all they were left with was despair, disappointment, discouragement, confusion. Have you been in that place before? Have you been in that place where it feels like God is dead? And in all of whatever you're experiencing, you wonder, how can God be alive and this still happen to me? And it's confusing, it's difficult. We have here, as we're almost to the end of the book of Matthew, and it says here in Matthew chapter 27, and we're looking at verse 50, and we're going to be skipping through parts. I'll paraphrase a few in my own words, but we'll be reading a good section of the rest of this chapter and into 28. Matthew 27, verse 50, it says, "And Jesus cried out again with a loud voice and yielded up his spirit." Jesus died. And it describes that the curtain of the temple, that curtain that separated people from the most holy place, it was ripped from top to bottom. This was a thick curtain. And it ripped from top to bottom, and the earth shook. The earth shook, and the rocks were split, the tombs were opened, and many bodies of the saints who had fallen asleep were raised. It says in verse 54, "When the centurion and those who were with him, keeping watch over Jesus, saw the earthquake and what took place, they were filled with awe and said, 'Truly, this was the Son of God.'" When those centurions right by Jesus on the cross saw these things happen, I think it's interesting. It says, and they saw the earthquake. We feel earthquakes, right? But I always thought that was odd. But as I was reading and preparing for this particular sermon, It was brand new information for me about why it says it saw the earthquake. Matthew is making a point here. We'll just stick that behind one ear and we'll come back to it. Verse 55. There were also many women there looking on from a distance. They were looking. Who had followed Jesus from Galilee, ministering to him, among whom were Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of James and Joseph, and the mother of the sons of Zebedee. So then, these women were there who had been with Jesus, who had witnessed this life and experience with him. And then as they were watching from afar, they saw Jesus die. They felt this earthquake. They saw everything happen. They're witnessing this. Then Joseph of Arimathea, who really has this cameo here, he steps into this story. We don't know much about him except for he was a wealthy man, and then he had a tomb, and that he loved Jesus. And when Jesus died, it was devastating, obviously, for him. And so he goes to Pilate, so he had some influence as well as money. He had influence, went to Pilate, and he said, please give me the body of Jesus. So Pilate gave him the body of Jesus, and he wrapped him in a very careful way, took him and put him in his own tomb, a tomb that no one had been laid in. Today we think about tombs, maybe if we go to the cemeteries in this area, you lay someone in the ground and that's where they're at, right? There's no, maybe if they have a spouse, that person will be buried with them, but there's no movement of it. But tombs in this day were, you walk in, it was a little cave, usually with a stone. The larger the opening, the more rich the space. And you will go in, and there's a slab that they would lay the body on, and then there were shelves carved into the rock. And after a year, someone would go in and collect the bones that are then left, and then put them into a smaller box and put them on the shelf. And then someone else could be laid down later into that same tomb. And so those tombs in those days were built for generations, like a mausoleum might be. And so they have that space there. And no one had been, this is a fresh tomb. I assume Joseph had created it for himself, or for his family members, and then later for himself. It's people that he loved. He put Jesus into this, I would imagine, a family burial place. And he laid Jesus down there. And it said, and a great stone was rolled into the entrance of the tomb and went away. And in verse 61, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary were there, sitting opposite the tomb. Matthew keeps coming back to these women, doesn't he? He's making a point here without expressly naming it. And we're going to pick this up along the way. Then it talks about how, since all this was happening on Friday, right? And so Jesus was put in the tomb, the women saw where he was placed, that the stone had been rolled in front of it. Well, the priests and the Pharisees had dropped out of this story in Matthew until this point for a couple of chapters now. And here they come back into the picture, and they're standing with the priests, and they're asking that Pilate send some troops to guard the tomb, because they remember that this imposter has said that he will raise again, and we don't want the disciples to pull something tricky, some sort of publicity stunt, and say that he rose again. Please, will you put some soldiers there in front of the tomb, make sure, and secure it, make it as secure as you can, it says very specifically. So they went and they sealed the stone, probably with wax, and they probably put a seal in it also, and so it couldn't be opened without tampering with that seal. And then the soldiers were stationed there around the tomb. Now, chapter 28. Now, after the Sabbath was over, toward the dawn of the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary went to see the tomb. And behold, there was a great earthquake, another earthquake, for an angel of the Lord descended from heaven and came and rolled back the stone and sat on it. His appearance was like lightning, and his clothes white as snow. As for fear of him, the guards trembled and became like dead men. Isn't that interesting? There's an earthquake when Jesus dies, and there's an earthquake when he raises, right? There's soldiers next to Jesus when he dies, and there's soldiers next to him when he raises. There's women watching from afar, and then there's women watching from this space, and it says, but the angel said to the women, do not be afraid, for I know that you seek Jesus who was crucified. The soldiers weren't seeking Jesus. They were trying to hold him in there. But the angels told the women, don't be afraid, because we know you're here looking for Jesus. He is not here, for he has risen. As he said, come, see the place where he lay, where he used to lay. Then go quickly and tell his disciples that he has risen from the dead. And behold, he is going before you to Galilee, where you will see him. See, I have told you. So they departed quickly from the tomb with fear and great joy, and ran to tell his disciples. What a witness this is. These women are accentuated, are put on this very special, in this very special spotlight in Matthew's story here, that they're there when Jesus dies, they're there when he's buried, and they're there watching when he to witness to his resurrection, to talk with the angel there. What a witness. The women in this story are the first witnesses of the promise of the resurrection. They are the first ones to go and tell what they saw. Sometimes we can get so overwhelmed by, we might watch an evangelist on TV, or maybe go to a special seminar, or we might hear somebody talk about Jesus and think, oh, I don't know if I could do it like that. We get quite overwhelmed with this idea of witnessing, and we feel like we don't measure up. But the reality is that a witness only tells what they themselves have seen. Otherwise, they're not a true witness, right? These women, all they could say, they couldn't explain why, they couldn't explain even how, because they came to the tomb and the angel was already there, and all that is going on. But we saw him die. We saw him be put in the tomb, and we saw that it was empty. And that's what they ran to tell. Whatever we have, we go with and we go to tell. That's what we're called to be witnesses as. So they departed quickly with fear and great joy, and ran to tell his disciples, and behold, Jesus met them and said, greetings. Isn't that Jesus is showing up? And they came up and took hold of his feet and worshipped him. Then Jesus said, do not be afraid. Go and tell my brothers to go to Galilee, and there they will see me. This seeing, it's repeated, and it's so beautiful that all these women see all these things, and then this is how they respond. The women respond with great joy and fear, and they go and tell. Impulsively. They're told to do it, but they do it with this weird, wonderful joy in their hearts. Now the guards. So while they were going, look what Matthew's doing, going back and forth between these two groups of people. Some of the guard went into the city and told the chief priests all that had taken place. Oh, they went and told too. The guards did. But listen. And when they had assembled with the elders and taken counsel, they gave a sufficient sum of money to the soldiers and said, tell the people, his disciples came by night and stole him away while we were asleep. And if this comes to the governor's ears, we will satisfy him and keep you out of trouble. So, devastating. So, they took the money and did as they were directed. And this story has been spread among the Jews to this day, and it's still trending, isn't it? The women saw with fear and joy, they ran and told. The soldiers saw, they trembled at the earthquake. Out of fear, they ran and told. But then they changed their story. They decided to lie. For what? For what? Money. Pressure. How sad that those things kept them from being alongside the women in this witness. What an incredible story this could have been if they had joined in and saying, are you kidding me? We saw angels. Are you kidding me? We saw him come out of the tomb. The women didn't even see Jesus. I mean, in this gospel, it's kind of brushed over. But the other gospels, they didn't see Jesus until later. They were already on their way. The soldiers next to Jesus, they saw him die. They saw all that happened. Without the resurrection, they said, this is the Son of God. They knew it. It was clear. That was their conclusion. But then these other soldiers, what's with them? I don't understand it. In fact, I don't really even understand the women. Because if I'm in the place that they were in times when I've been in despair and discouragement, I think it would have been in their space, if I was in their space, it would be very, very, very difficult for me to, one, be there at the cross and watch my friend, my Savior, the one that embodied all of my hopes and dreams, die. That would be very difficult to watch. It'd be hard to watch anybody go through that, but to see also this person that means so much, that has done so much for me, suffer and die. That is too much. And then these women, they go with this body and they watch as they put Jesus in the tomb. They put his body in the tomb and they watch it being sealed up like there's nothing. It's done. It's so over. And then on Sunday morning to decide that I'm going to go back to that place of discouragement. That is hard. But we see these women go in their own experience of disillusionment and they go close to Jesus to see him. In that moment, Mary had heard that he said that he was going to die. But it seems like every time he talked about the resurrection, it kind of just faded out of their memories, out of their minds. They weren't necessarily going there to watch him rise, because we know from the other Gospels they were carrying spices to anoint his body, because they didn't have time on Friday to get those things prepared. So they're going there expecting him to still be dead. What do you do in your times of discouragement, disillusionment of faith, of depression? Do you go to Jesus knowing that he might be completely silent, knowing that he may not respond at all? Do you still go to Jesus? And for what? What? So these experiences what have you done with your own experience? With what you have seen and what you've experienced? You know, it's even though at this point in the story, Jesus is resurrected, they saw him with joy. Their whole narrative is switched around. It would be a shame to end before the end of Matthew. It's not a good idea to, if you're watching a movie and it gets to a part that you don't like, what do? You fast forward. yeah, I think I do that too. Fast forward, but to say stop and then say, I don't want to watch this anymore. I think I've done that with some TV shows. I've gotten to a certain point where I'm like, what are they doing with this character? Like, it's so discouraging. But then on some level, you're thinking, well, I wonder what happens, right? So you might skip to the next episode or might maybe just watch it. One time I just watched the last episode to see if I even wanted to watch the whole show. And to read the end is important. So it says this, verse 16. Now the 11 disciples went to Galilee, to the mountain to which Jesus had directed them. And when they saw him, they worshipped him, but some doubted. And Jesus came and said to them, all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all that I have commanded you. And behold, I am with you always to the end of the age. Matthew completes his story about Jesus with this great commission, as it's become to be known. This great commissioning for us to go and teach and make disciples. And it's beautiful, it's incredible by itself. But something that we've learned while going through the book of Matthew, since we started in December, right? We've completed the book of Matthew. That's pretty neat. And to go through the book of Matthew, we've recognized that it's not just about these stories of Jesus. We realize that Matthew, from the very beginning, chapter 1, he's been echoing the Old Testament from Genesis on. We've seen how Matthew opens the story of Jesus by putting these amazing tiebacks, these echoes back to Genesis, to creation, and then to the patriarchs, and then to the prophets, and then all the way there. Wouldn't you expect that Matthew is doing something special here in this last closing section, also in mirroring the Old Testament? He is. I didn't know it until I've been working on this particular sermon series and then looking at this particular Sabbath message. And I didn't see it until it was pointed out to me, because honestly, it was an obscure reference that I wasn't too familiar with. Does it ring a bell to any of you? I've read the Bible a number of times, and I've read the section I'm about to bring us to a number of times, but I never saw it before. Jesus here, Matthew closes his story of Jesus with this great commissioning for a very important reason. What is the last book of the Old Testament? Sorry. Malachi. Now that's in our arrangement. But did you know that the books of the Old Testament used to be arranged in a different way? It was arranged in a different way up until the time of the exile of God's people into Babylon. And when they went through this world-altering experience, the order was shifted around. And can you imagine, they were on scrolls, right? So it wasn't necessarily like a book that has a beginning and end. It was just the order of the scrolls, and then eventually when it got into this form, it kind of stuck. It's a great thing to understand the history of the Bible and how we got that. I'd love to go through that with you at any point. But Ezra, he arranged the Old Testament in the way that we have it today, just as they were coming back into Jerusalem from exile. And Ezra, knowing that the last book of the Bible being 2nd Chronicles of all books, kind of odd for our perspective, 2nd Chronicles, what even happens in 2nd Chronicles? We don't, and we might think about that and process through that. But 2nd Chronicles was the end of the Old Testament. And we look here at the last chapter of 2nd Chronicles, and we find that there is this echoing of Jesus' Great Commission with the last chapter, last paragraph of 2nd Chronicles chapter 36. And I'm going to read a few paragraphs before that, just to give you some context. 2nd Chronicles chapter 36, verse 14. This is what was in Matthew's mind when he wrote down the words of Jesus and kept it and finalized his story this way. So it talks about how, the striving of God's people all the way to that bitter end with Babylon coming and taking over. You think, that's horrible. What was the context of their being led into captivity? 2nd Chronicles 36, verse 14. All the officers of the priests and people likewise were exceedingly unfaithful, following all the abominations of the nations. And they polluted the house of the Lord that he had made holy in Jerusalem. The Lord, the God of their fathers, sent persistently to them by his messengers, because he had compassion on his people and on his dwelling place. But they kept mocking the messengers of God, despising his words and scoffing at his prophets, until the wrath of the Lord rose against his people, until there was no remedy. And all the vessels of the house of God, great and small, and the treasures of the house of the Lord, and the treasures of the king and his princes, all these he brought to Babylon. And they burned the house of God, and broke down the wall of Jerusalem, and burned all its palaces with fire, and destroyed all its precious vessels. He took into exile in Babylon those who had escaped from the sword, and they became servants to him and to his sons until the establishment of the kingdom of Persia, to fulfill the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah, until the land had enjoyed its Sabbaths. All the days that it lay desolate, it kept Sabbath to fulfill 70 years. If this was the end of this story, it would be pretty dismal. Some commentators on the Bible think that this last paragraph here, which is actually the first paragraph of the book of Ezra, was just copied and tacked on, maybe because it was too intense. How would you like if the movie just ended in that kind of desolation? But this last paragraph here, tacked onto the end. Now in the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia, that the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah might be fulfilled, the Lord stirred up the spirit of Cyrus, king of Persia, so that he made a proclamation all his kingdom, throughout all his kingdom, and put it in writing. And this is what he said. Listen to the word selection of Cyrus, and then think about what Jesus had said. Thus says Cyrus, king of Persia, the Lord, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and he has charged me to build him a house at Jerusalem, which is in Judah. Whoever is among you of all his people, may the Lord his God be with him. Let him go up. All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me, Jesus said. Go therefore and make disciples of all nations. The parallel here, this triplet is echoed from King Cyrus's words and by Jesus. And Matthew is so intentional about having the Jewish reader who understands those stories, that is born into this culture and understanding of the Old Testament, to realize that Jesus is the fulfillment of their story. And this beyond superficial reading of these texts, tying in the Old Testament scriptures and looking at how Jesus fulfills these stories one by one, these stories that were left hanging, these stories that had fallen apart, these people's lives that had dead ended. Jesus picks back up and he does it right. He relives our lives the way they should have been. And it's his righteousness, his perfection, that is somehow credited to us. And that our stories are rewritten through his life, through his story. It's wild. It's wild to think that our Savior lived his life and then in a very serious, full way, real way, rewrote ours. We will be looking at this Great Commission over the next 2 weeks, 2 Sabbaths, and then we'll be looking into the book of Hebrews, which is Paul has the same intention as Matthew did in showing that Jesus is the fulfillment of all that came before. And he uses the stories in a different way. I think certainly in a more direct way. He's drawing the ties very overtly between Jesus and the Old Testament. But it's going to be a wonderful journey. So I'm really looking forward to that with all of you. This ultimate rewrite that Matthew was explaining, that Jesus is Judah's ultimate rewrite, this redo, this fulfillment, this completion. And I thought of the illustration which some of these TV shows that used to be popular or that somehow got canceled before, maybe you have a precious one to you. The series of God's people was canceled a long time ago. But then this full-length theatrical release sequel comes out to wrap up those storylines that we had left before and wondered what happened to those characters that we cared so much about in times past. This is Matthew's equivalent to, and they lived happily ever after. How does Jesus tell your story back to you through his own story, his own life? Maybe you think about your own experience and you think about the times when you messed up or disadvantages that you had, lack of opportunity or just mistakes in general. Maybe you think about those things and you think, there's no way I can redo them. And it may be completely right, like, wish I had done it, taken a different path. Wish I had made this other choice. I wish the circumstances were different. But the reality is that Jesus, his story, rewrites ours in a way that we never could. Even with every opportunity, even with all the wisdom and knowledge that we might accrue. And he does it for you, he does it for me, and he does it for our eternity. This story of Jesus is so incredible. We've experienced it in such a special way through the eyes of Matthew. And I think my question to you is, what is your gospel of Jesus? What is your story? What have you seen him do? We can look at our own experience and we can see points that have shifted, changed because of our relationship with Jesus. And when we talk to other people and we hear their experience and they share what they've gone through, their story in a way truly becomes a part of our own. And their faith, it helps encourage our own. And that kind of interplay, that pressing together, that spiritual familiarity, that intimacy, that oneness that is created when we share our stories is essential. I've said this before, and I'll just keep saying it forever probably, but a church is much more than a worship program. It has to be. It has to be a community of people willing to be vulnerable willing to open up our experience and share with other people, saying, this happened, or this I've gone through, but this is what God did in my life. And that kind of unity, it builds an indelible bond that the Spirit fosters, creates, and makes like gold for our community. My appeal to you is simple. If you want God to rewrite your story, maybe you've already seen him doing that already, but if you want God to rewrite your story, I'd like to pray for you. And as we pray to close this sermon time before we move into the last times of worship and song, I just want you to place your hand over your heart and say, God, you know my heart. You know all I've gone through. You know my story from beginning to now. And maybe you need to tell him, I feel like I'm the women watching you die. I'm very discouraged right now. Maybe you say, I feel like I don't know what is going to happen next, but I need you to write it. And God sees your hand. I'll have my eyes closed. But trust that God knows what he's doing. He's the author and finisher of our faith, and he can be trusted. Let's pray. Our incredible Father in heaven, thank you for being a God that sees us, that knew us before we were born, that saw every step, every chapter of our lives unfold, every decision we made, everything that happened to us. You know it all. You've seen it all. And you offer yourself. That's unfathomable. You give us yourself, and you ask to be invited into our stories. God, right now, we are inviting you into our story to rewrite this narrative, this trajectory that we are on. Thank you for being such a compassionate, personal God. Teach us to trust you more. And may we see you. May we see you. May we run and tell. And look forward to that great day when you come back in the clouds of glory. We ask and pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen. May God bless you.